Welcome to the City Conversation, and thank you so much for joining. My name is Oyin Talabi. I work as an energy engineer at Happold, and I'm also part of the Happold Foundation community. So I'll be chairing this panel on invisible citizens, and today I hope we can really explore gender bias in city design. I have 6 awesome speakers who I'm so excited to hear from, and they'll share on their experiences and the amazing work that they're doing in this space. So the format of this event will be a 5-minute presentation from each speaker, and we would have a discussion at the end where we would encourage the audience to get involved, and you can ask questions or raise general comments. We'll be using the Zoom or raise general comments. We'll be using the Zoom raise hand function and the chat window as well. We'll encourage you to also turn on your camera so you can get involved in the discussion, but also please mute yourself whilst the speakers are talking as well. We do recognize that this is a sensitive topic for most, so we ask that everyone remains respectful and considerate of others on the call, especially when raising questions or comments at the end. So before I do introduce the speakers, I thought I'll provide some context of today's discussion. As an engineer, I do love my numbers, so I thought I'll start with a few statistics, which I'm sure most people in the UK would have heard or seen recently. So a recent UK survey found that 97% of women aged between 18 and 25 have been sexually harassed, and 80% of women of all ages have experienced sexual harassment in public spaces. The year ending March 2020, 84% of victims relating to sexual offences were women or female, according to the data from England and Wales. These are currently focused on harassment, but I guess talking about city design, if you look at transportation, which is quite specific, men are 2 times more likely to cycle in the city than women, and 27% of women think that cycling safety is good in their cities, which obviously means most women think that the safety of cycling isn't necessarily great. So honestly, with those numbers and how high some of the sexual harassment numbers are, I think there's a lot of behavioral issues that would need to be challenged as part of a wider discussion. But also, I think built environment professionals have a part to play, and the people that work on creating these spaces have a part to play. We must ensure that our designs are inclusive and safe for all of its users. And we need to try to start tackling some of these issues where we can. If you're in the UK, due to recent events, you would know that concerns about safety have recently regained momentum. And there's a lot of conversations about women's safety, sexual harassment, and gender-based violence. Many have shared their experiences in the past few months, and there's generally been a call for these issues to be taken more seriously. So today, as much as I would like to cover some of the issues faced by women, I would also like to focus on some of the solutions and what we can actively do in this space. I should say that today's discussion is mainly focused on women, but it's important to also note that cities must be designed for everyone, regardless of what diversity group they identify with, whether that is race, sexual orientation, abilities or disabilities, or a socioeconomic background. Also, it's important to note that every woman, depending on their background, would experience cities differently and would interact with cities differently. So we must take an intersectional approach in terms of city design. So without further delay, I am going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Hannah Corlett. She's the founder of HNNA, a studio of urban designers and architects who combine research and practice to reconsider how we design our cities. Hannah, welcome.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for the introduction. Time is short today, so I'll jump straight into sharing my screen. In summary, I think a clear statement is that if a city is built by and for heterosexual, able-bodied men, it will inevitably neglect the needs, interests, and routines of other, shall we say, less visible citizens. And we can't deny that this is going to impact on their access to jobs, education, their freedom, safety, health, and agency. And of course, it will reinforce gender inequalities. But I'm actually pleased that today's talk is titled Invisible Citizens, because actually much of what we're going to talk about today will not exclusively affect women, nor will it affect all women. And actually addressing issues purely with a gender agenda can be problematic. It can actually in its own way be highly excluding and segregating. So much of the way that we operate in a city is very subconscious and ingrained. And this can mean that really seeing what the problems and solutions are can be difficult. But today I've selected 3 actually quite small areas in terms of the larger conversation to touch on. But as an urban designer, I think that these areas are a good way of creating better spatial equality in our cities, and particularly for the less, shall we say, overt citizens. The first representation is representation within design. It takes us to this famous Jane Jacobs quote about who should be designing and for whom. I think representation within the design team is obviously key, but it should by no means be considered representative, even if it's very diverse. Diversity within a design team does not alleviate the need for research and engagement specific to a site and its users. As a single mum, I can't represent all single mums. My difficulties are influenced by a wealth of factors within my situation that will inevitably be different from others. Acknowledging what we don't know is key. Here, I think that public engagement is at least part of the answer. Typically, public consultation is treated within the industry as a bit of another box tick, but it can be essential if it's embraced as a potential and not seen as a thing that you just have to do. I always ask my students, in addition to my practice, I teach at the Bartlett, and I always ask my students there to engage with the users of the site as much as its fabric. And in a recent public engagement event in Eritrea, the students both observed the sites and then engaged with the users of the sites. There's quite a few different sites across Asmara, and it was actually really fascinating to see how it influenced them. Having spent time observing the sites previously, they were actually really quick to note that those who shared their views were not representative demographic. Often the invisible citizens, such as women and the elderly, were very reluctant to come forward. So hearing a representative voice can be difficult. Types of layered approach, which understand how to give people the time and space to feel comfortable to share their experiences, can be incredibly fruitful and dictate successful design and adoption. Here, I think social media and platforms that aren't street or event-based work well. Now, through both my practice at HNNA and through teaching at the Bartlett, I've come to the understanding that designing inclusive environments means creating diversity of place for a diversity of user, not creating a singular, homogeneous, inclusive for all approach. Of course, this can raise issues of sort of gender domination and how these differ culturally and how they differ within age groups. I think Jane Rendell's writing distinguishing between the male dominance of the street and the female occupation of the courtyard is really interesting, and it really showed synthesis with my students' observations when we were looking at Morocco, where the ground plane was noted to be male and the roofscape female. Now, gender division within some cultures can seem less obvious, but it's still present. Take, for example, the use of play space. Early years show significant gender equality, but by the early teens, we see a distinct male dominance, and the overlaying marking of, say, netball or volleyball courts within a public basketball court, which is often a sort of tokenistic approach, simply shows a misunderstanding of the way gender dominance works. A recent example in Vienna showed separate courts and increasing seating areas, lighting and footpaths all had a significant impact on raising the number of girls who are actually not very frequent users of most parks in 2 of their major parks. The truth is that if spatial occupation is competitive, women back off and therefore miss out. The last issue is understanding how important it is to design for the night as well as for the day. Both architects and urban designers are all guilty of not doing enough of this. It's here that I observe the most fundamental shift in the way that genders occupy the city, and too many women feel a subconscious curfew or at least a significant reduction to their spatial equality. This is undoubtedly worsened by the media, but it's far from a perceived fear. Reclaiming the night movement, which started in 1976, which happens to be the year of my birth, it has actually not was to highlight the issue, but the situation hasn't significantly improved in all that time. Designing for fear reduction and tangible safety has got many factors, but time is short, so I thought I'd just raise one. The most obvious ones here, I would say, are generally lighting and transportation. And through one small example, the bus stop, I think we can show how easily improvements can be made. Now, policies to address this have been successful. They're inexpensive. They're reasonably easy to utilise. And these include request buses that don't require vulnerable people to wait at stops, additional lighting to the periphery of bus stops, because it's obvious that actually with bright spots highlighting a particular area, it actually reduces your peripheral vision and therefore your safety. Now, with steps like these, and actually just a general consideration of who the designers are, who the users are, how they use the space, and the fact that for considerable hours every day, we disadvantage vulnerable people. I think as designers, we can make real headway. But I'm sure the other speakers today will touch on many further points. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hannah. There's definitely a lot to explore in that, so I look forward to the discussion at the end. So our second speaker is Sarah Williams. Sarah is an associate professor of technology and urban planning at MIT. She combines her training in computation and design to create communication strategies that expose urban policy issues to broad audiences and create civic change. Welcome, Sarah.
As was said, I'm associate professor of technology and urban planning at MIT, and I also run the Civic Data Design Lab and the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. My research focuses on how we can use data for policy change and is also the subject of my new book. Today, I want to talk a little bit about how data is essential for making decisions, yet despite considerable progress in recent years, whole groups of people are not being counted. An important aspect of people's lives and environment conditions are still not measured. And for people, this can lead to a denial of basic rights. Sorry, I don't know. And so the poor are often socially marginalized and voiceless, and the collective, objective, and quantitative data is crucial in locating them and formulating policy. The World Bank says it's another deprivation to end. So much so that the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030 made data an important part of each one of the areas of focus. So how can we make data that doesn't exist? And I would say that you have to collect it or build it yourself. So I'm going to talk about a project where we did this, but did this through the lens of women's needs. In a project that was done right before the pandemic, we mapped data on the Concho system in Santiago in the Dominican Republic. Conchos are small vehicles like these vans are larger ones that really act as the main form of public transit. They have routes and stops. And we use a data collection tool shown here in partnership with volunteers to collect data on the system. Users mark stops, and as they mark those stops, they also marked safety issues, and in particular, safety issues related to women. We worked with several women's groups in Santiago who also went to the various bus stops to document and address both the urban design concerns, but also their concerns for safety in the urban environment. The result was a map of routes with photos at each location and stop, documenting not only the stop exists there, but also the concerns of women who get on and off the public transport at that location. We had 28 volunteers, and over the course of 1 week, we're able to create a complete map of the system, which we then translated into a map that looks something like this. This map was also uploaded onto Google, and you can now find your way on the Concho system in Google Maps, also understanding the safety concerns. The women who were part of this project presented the map to the city and government of Santiago, as well as the Concho unions, as exhibited here. And this is one of the women volunteers presenting that data. Semi-formal mobility, like the Conchos, provides mobility around the world. And we work with cities in Latin America and Africa to help develop these kinds of data sets at our resource center for mapping informal transit. Creating essential data helps us visualize the needs of women and is important as we think of the urban design and designing our cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So interesting. I can definitely see that project being replicated in loads of places around the world, really. So definitely really interesting. So our third speaker is Öykü. She's a city planner with an educational and professional focus on sustainable urbanism. She's currently working as a sustainability manager. She works on providing affordable housing that's sustainable and inclusive over the whole life cycle. Öykü? Yes, we can see that.
Thanks a lot, Oyin, for the introduction, and thanks, Andrew, for the technical support there. Well, based on my experience in sustainability consulting, I want to put on my finger on topics that I think requires emphasis on gender and gender inclusiveness when we talk about sustainable urbanism and in particular sustainable housing. So let me start with some things that you probably already know. Our construction industry and urban areas, they're polluting. Urban areas cause 70% of all global emissions and 60% of all resource consumption. Just the buildings are responsible for 35% of all global emissions. So it's pretty clear for us all today that we need to change something in the way we build our cities, right? And still of today, the most carbon efficient, emission-free, resource-saving way of building is actually not building, right? But we still need to build. There are societal needs and we want to leave a positive impact. In fact, 70% of all buildings in India that will stand in India in 2050 are still yet to be built. So, and a considerable amount of it to be housing. So it's really not only about how we are building, but also why and for whom we are building and allocating our resources. So there comes the rhetoric of sustainability and sustainable urbanism, where we need to have a holistic vision and include this from the beginning on into the whole life cycle. If you go to the next slide, one of the most critical elements of sustainable urbanism is actually mobility, and it's also a very important factor for housing providers to consider what kind of mobility infrastructure they provide their residents with, right? And one example of it is e-mobility. E-mobility is something we push a lot in the recent years, right? Including charging stations for electric cars. What we also know today is that more than 90% of electric car buyers are actually male. So this brings us to the question, if we actually can reach our goals, including our environmental goals, if the infrastructure we are providing is not accessible to a very large group of people in society, right? So mobility is really gender specific as it is environmental. Another example is public transportation. Women have actually a higher affinity towards using public transport, but also at the same time a much higher rate of having safety problems, as we also heard. And there are various studies showing us data about what are the particular concerns and problems that women face in public transport, as well as design and policy suggestions. One of them, for example, being also relevant to housing providers, that we need to consider public transport trips as end-to-end trips, where we have to consider also the last walking miles from the station to the apartment as to be safe and comfortable for women as well. One bad example I can show you is on the next slide, an implementation that has been done in a Turkish city a couple of years ago. Yeah, there it is. Where due to raising concerns of women having security problems in public transportation, they implemented the so-called pink buses, the women-only buses in Turkey. So this is obviously not a sustainable solution, as well as it was criticized back then. It is literally discriminating women, right? So if you go to the next slide, what I want to emphasize on today is that when we talk about sustainable housing, we are not only talking about carbon efficient housing or environmental friendly housing, but there are various elements that have to be considered if we want our development to make sense today and tomorrow, to its full function. So, and when we look at these elements, we see that a lot of them are not gender neutral. And we need to understand that not only for able-bodied straight men, but also for women, what does accessibility mean? What does affordability mean? Indoor comfort, including thermal comfort, mobility patterns, site quality and safety, just to name some of them. So it's very important for us to understand and cater these needs. Also specifically, specific requirements in terms of women's needs. Well, traditionally, there are individual housing projects where planning and design decisions are mostly based on a gut feeling and intuitive gut feeling, and measures to think of inclusivity or even in general sustainability are seen as some add-on feature that we might think at some point in the end of the project, just because we have to somehow, and it will decrease the probably decrease the commercial success and profit of the project. But how we can think of it as an alternative way is having a product approach to housing development. If you could go to the next slide, Andrew, thanks. So where we have an extensive product strategy for our development and actually start with defining our target audience for whom we are building for, and systematically analyze our target group, collect and analyze data about the preferences and concerns, so that we can cater our design and planning according to these needs. And then this would hardly make an obstacle to commercial viability, but on the contrary, actually. So this is something that I want to emphasize on a lot, that we have to make sure this analysis to come in the beginning phases. But also, if I want to say a few words about the planning side as well, before that I am extending my time too much, hopefully. Just one last thing is that although I want to emphasize the data point a lot, I think we also cannot ignore the planning side of things, where urban planning and design fields are still a lot dominated by men, which brings us more to a one-sided perspective to design and planning. And I was looking up for it. It is still 10% as the percentage of women right now in high-ranking positions in leading architectural firms, for example. So I also wanted to emphasize today on the fact that I think it's not really possible to have gender inclusive spaces and housing unless the planning side is also, the imbalance in this planning side is solved as well. Yeah, thanks a lot for hearing, and looking forward to hear your thoughts on these.
Thanks, Öykü. Really interesting points. I think data and representation are two key points that keep coming up. So that's interesting. Our next speaker is Rumana Kabir. Rumana has a background in architecture and a broad experience of working globally in conflict, emergency, and development contexts. She leads and delivers strategies in housing, community development, and disaster risk governance projects. Rumana, welcome.
Thank you, Oyin. Hello, everyone. I am sharing my slide. Please let me know when you start, when you can see. Are you able
we can
to
see that.
Perfect. So I will talk about my experience of working in Bangladesh on community-led low-income housing project for the government of Bangladesh. Before I start, I would like you all to look at this picture of this little girl, because when I took this picture back in 2018, when we started the project, I thought about the quote of architect Luai Khan, who designed the parliament building and the adjacent complex for the government. He said that a city should be a place where a boy can grow up, walk in the streets, and decide what he wants to be when he grows up. I was thinking, what would be the future for this girl when I took this picture? As you can see, she's standing under some pavement slabs. So under this is the drainage projects, which is done by different actors, government, local organization, non-government organizations, to improve the living conditions of the slums. I will go to my next slide. As we already know, Bangladesh is a very climate vulnerable and disaster-prone country. 500,000 people migrate to urban areas annually. And the problem is quite big. Although the government had plans to provide housing for all by 2021, that was in the previous policy, that didn't happen, unfortunately, because the problem is really huge. And most of these people who migrate to the cities live in the slums. In this picture, you can see the four rings. The red one is the capital city. The problem is tremendously unprecedented. And the other three secondary cities where we worked are very near to the capital city. So I will share the example of those secondary cities, how the development projects are going on in terms of housing. So this is the picture of the project implementation team. The people in high-vis jacket, these are the consulting firm who I was part of when we designed the program. As I said, the project is for the government of Bangladesh. It's a World Bank loan to the government, and the National Housing Authority is our client who is in charge of this project. But they have a very limited presence on ground outside the national level, the city level, capital city. So we worked very closely. In this picture, you can see the city authorities. The man in blue, top right, third right, is the mayor of the city, and the lady in the sari, she's one of the city councillor. And the other lady on the topmost, on the left, is the architect, community architect. Although it's very difficult to ensure gender balance in project teams, we made a difference because we could work with women leaders and women professionals in this project. This project had 3 steps. First, acknowledging the fact that slums are not illegal, they're informal. We acknowledge that by designing the city maps together with the local government and the community volunteers. Step 2 was making inclusive decision. We all talk about consultation, but consulting is one thing and decision-making is another thing. We need to engage communities in participatory planning process. That's what we established in this project. And the third part is, of course, the implementation. And as I mentioned, the problem is huge and incremental implementation is the way to go forward. This is one of the picture of a slum clearance in Dhaka city. In the name of development, slums are cleared because they're seen as illegal settlements. To change the situation in the secondary cities, which you can see in the map, all the red spots are the slums or informal settlements. And this community architect, Sonia, she's explaining the team leader and the World Bank team that these settlements are the places which has been surveyed and we need to work in these areas. But as we had limited time and limited project requirement, we couldn't work in all the places. So the decision need to be made where we can work. And that decision was made collectively with the communities as well as the city authorities, so that there is no conflict amongst the neighboring communities. Step 2 was the inclusive planning process. We consulted both men, women, as well as the children. In this picture on the right, you can see two men. One is our community architect who took over from me, Nazmus Sakib, and the other one is our community mobilizer. They're working together with the women to understand all the infrastructure and all the settlement issues in detail. We did the same kind of consultation with men as well, and children. I'll show you the pictures later. Step 2 was also about making the final decision. When you do all the plans, settlement master plans, you talk in a collective gathering so that the confirmation is clear amongst the community members. Step 3 is the implementation. Sakib, my colleague, he shared the latest picture of how things are looking now. As you can see, it's a really small step. We just try to improve the narrow alleyways. Before, the communities, they were trying to solve their own problem by cementing the narrow alleyways so that they don't get flooded, and then they had some interim solutions for drainage. But now people are in charge of maintaining, and you can see how clean it looks, to make sure that flood doesn't happen in all the settlements. As you know, that there is a big problem of flood, so that was one of the priority. So this is what's happening now. But like I was saying earlier, we did consult children. We asked people to draw their vision for the next 20 years. And as you can see in that diagram, there is a picture of a culvert, which is connecting the river and also draining the water from the settlement and the streets to the river, because people are always facing seasonal floods. And they also had vision about cars, 3-story building, but they also wanted to keep their trees, the paddy field, and also make sure children have playground. So these are people's vision, and we try to implement this vision into reality. This is a model of one of the settlement plan. There were not one model, there were lots of different, not more than 3 options we developed for each of these settlements to make sure people can choose what's the best option for them, and they can implement incrementally. In terms of housing, the housing is left for the people to design. We develop some guidelines, and people are going to do the housing on their own will, because there is a finance group which is also helping the people to get some money to be able to finance their own housing. So infrastructure is our priority, so infrastructure has been done at the moment. Finally, I would like to share this picture with you. Cities grow like trees. The people who are the root of the city, they build the city. Our key message to the government of Bangladesh when we designed the project proposal was to make sure that it's easily understandable that we need to acknowledge the citizens, not treat the slum dwellers as invisible citizens, and take their vision into account when we do city planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rumana. I think you can really see the impact of engaging the community in terms of design, the impact it has on what's actually achieved. So our 5th speaker today is Sophonpanich. She's worked in the humanitarian sector for over 13 years, and her expertise span over emergency preparedness, response and recovery, with particular focus on shelter, settlement, and camp coordination and management. Welcome, Wan.
Hi, thank you very much, Oyin, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the discussion today. So I would like to talk through a bit of the work that we've been doing around site planning in the humanitarian settings. So coming from a slightly different perspective, I'm sharing with you some photos just to give you an idea of the situation and the context that we normally work in. If I can figure out how to change it. Yeah. So a little bit about what we do in camp management, or what we call, or site management sometime. This often happens after displacement. And some of our key roles in managing a displacement location includes things like ensuring participation and representation of all the population living in those locations. We also coordinate services and assistance as well as do things like complaint feedback mechanism and referral in coordination with other actors working in the area. And the other one is around ensuring safe and dignified living environment for the people there. I want to manage expectation a little bit of when we talk about site planning. Often we're talking about working in a sector where resources, whether it's money or time or capacity is often in short supplies. There's often a pressure of like, how many people, how long is this going to take, and how much is it going to cost? And another challenge we face is often by the time we're talking about site planning, people are already there. Often spontaneous or informal settlement after disaster happens way before we start discussing, like how to best or most safely occupy a land or a landscape. This was from Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. And this is a situation we find it, I think at the time we start talking about how to define areas, how to look at making footpaths, and where new arrivals should be located in a very, very challenging landscape and geographical situation. And also the fact that, we draw lines on paper and reality, and the length of time in which people end up having to occupy those spaces can change a lot the intentions and the planning process. One of our job, as I mentioned, as part of our core responsibilities, is to make sure that people stay within that equation and discussion around planning and improvement. When I say planning and site improvement is because I feel like planning process should not be seen as a one-off process. What we've been working over the past 6 or 7 years is to look at how to mitigate and prevent risks related to gender-based violence. Some of the work, we can look at it from two sides. One is to make sure that people that work in site planning in the humanitarian sectors are informed, aware, and trained actually to look for signs and clues and how to engage with people that work with communities and in engaging with different groups living in the location. Often, I think a lot of people who are formally educated on how to do planning are not familiar with how it works in the humanitarian sector. So often there's a whole kind of re-education that happens often on the job and working with limited resources, different kind of restrictions and regulations that may be applied only to displacement sites within any given country. The other side of the conversation that we do, obviously, it's about making sure that women and girls in these displacement locations are also able to participate and engage in decision-making process while displaced. We are often there to support formation or support existing camp committee of sort. There are many locations and contexts we enter to work in where all of the camp committees or sector leaders are male. And I think as a few speakers mentioned also, this can also be like cultural norms and practices. The access to public spaces, we find that for girls often decrease significantly as they enter into adolescence. So it's about also like training and working with or setting up women's groups, women committees within the camps to make sure they're able to be represented. I think as we go into the work, we also find that we're working more and more also to increase visibility and engagement of those with disabilities living in the camps. Often access to services and information is one of their biggest challenge faced in order to be able to participate and provide inputs into how sites are planned or upgrades are carried out. And I think this is something that, you know, it can be seen as scary. I think discussions around planning, it seems specialized and it seems technical. And often it's like also normalizing and I think simplifying the way in which we talk about the planning process, but also the impact on how this affect their quality of lives and their families' qualities of lives. And I think I'm just going to stop there. Thank you very much, Oyin.
Thank you, Wen. Very interesting. Our last and final speaker is Pedro Silva Costa. Pedro is an urbanist and architect. His main interest is in how urbanism can address social issues faced by minorities using design as a tool to create tolerant, respectful, and inclusive public spaces. Pedro, welcome.
Well, yeah, also hi everyone again, and thanks to the Happold Foundation for the invite, and also thanks to the previous speakers. I was saying that it is a bit of responsibility to say something after all these great presentations, but I'll try to add something to the table, because I think that it's never enough to look at different ways on how we can improve our cities. And something that really fascinates me is to be able to discuss city design with a different point of perspective in mind. And for me, is to put any marginalized or vulnerable group in our society first. And what I brought here to illustrate that is our spatial study for the reallocation of the red light district in The Hague. So the municipality of The Hague, just a quick context, the municipality of The Hague has taken the decision to investigate the relocation of the red light district from its current location to a new site. In the future, it is speculated that this site will become a central innovation district, a large-scale regeneration project with the ambition to redefine it as The Hague's new city center. But we see the move of the red light district in The Hague as an opportunity to improve the working conditions of sex workers in The Hague, because the current circumstances in which the sex workers perform their work are far from ideal. And that goes from how the system works, with them not being very independent to the system, but also like in terms of size, security, and hygiene conditions of the physical working spaces. And in our spatial proposal, we sought to elevate the voices and agency of sex workers by involving them in the process and developing our design. So there will be no other way of doing that if not listening from the sex workers. What are their needs and desires, in order to understand what is the relationship of the sex workers with the city and how they interact with space. From them, concerns were raised, like the fact that that the new place should tackle abuse and exploitation, that they expect the realization of a safe and healthy workplaces for all forms of sex work, and also that everyday services must be available so that they can do, for example, arrange banking affairs in the area. They also believe that the area should be easily accessible for sex workers and other residents. So our idea is that the new red light district could also be a platform for the sex workers, whether they want to be more proactive about their current work or if they wish to do something different in their lives. So we want to build the conditions for a supportive and collaborative ecosystem of partners to thrive in physical proximity with each other. So a place with spaces for skill development, where a sex worker can start her own bar, a place with partners in social justice, a place where they can do advocacy training or create a sex worker initiated festival, and also a place that brings culture into the place. So where sex work is also seen as an art or as a performance. Especially, our study for the red light district addresses key themes such as safety, health, and connectivity. Of course, I do not have the time to go like into detail of the project, but just to talk about like these three key topics. For example, connectivity, how it is important to really make this area connected to the surrounding, and how do we go from an island to a very connected area with public transport, with bike, pedestrian access, especially because there's always the thing that the sex workers, they work and they get paid in cash, for example. So when they leave in the working place, how do they get back home? How do they commute? So we really have to make sure that they do have like this access, easy access in the area. Concerns about safety. How do encourage the daily footfall from regular clients, visitors, and other users of the site, and allows for anonymity for the sex workers and their clients? How do you create this open space to avoid stress, but also sufficiently private and intimate so everyone can feel protected? And yeah, how do you think about this different circulations within the site, especially have in mind to give this privacy for the sex workers? And in terms of health, we can talk about like very different layers on how we could add health to the discussion. It goes from having a facility from the healthcare within the area, but it also relates to what kind of public spaces do we create in this area, what kind of greenery do we put there, what kind of spaces do we offer for them to have a break from their work, so not every time, the whole day or the shifts, they have to stay in the bedroom. But also when it comes to the architecture, how do we move away from the current bedroom size that they have right now to a bedroom that really allows them to have more hygienic and healthy working space, but also they allow for safety. For example, the fact that you need like 2 doors in case they need to escape, for example. So those are the things that we all have to take into consideration when thinking about these places. And yeah, our ambition here is to create space, literally and figuratively, for the multiplicity of voices in the sex work in The Hague, in the culture of sex work, in order to make it converse and thrive. That's it.
Thank you, Pedro. Very interesting project. Yes, definitely very unique. Really enjoyed that. So I guess I'll invite all the speakers back. So please get ready for questions. In terms of the audience, please get involved in the discussion. You can turn on your camera and raise your hand and you'll be invited to speak. You can also put your questions in the chat and I would read it out as well. So I have so many questions. I guess whilst the audience think about their questions, I have a few that I think will be good to start with just based on your presentation. So the first one I thought about that I think everyone kind of touched about was engagement of the people that you are designing for, whether that's the community or whether that's the sex workers. How do you, well, firstly, how important do you think this is and how do you ensure that that importance is passed on to them so they're able to actually understand why they need to engage with the process, and how do you build that trust with the community, I guess? So I would start with Hannah, because I think you talked about it, and then anyone else could pick up from there.
Thanks, Oyin. Yeah, I think it is really important, and my experience of it is that actually the hardest to reach people are often those who are the most fruitful to talk to, because those that are sort of readily engaged already or part of the members group or represented as, shall we say, the sort of more visible users, and who have sort of more common needs and less specific needs, they are open to communication, and people who are the harder to reach, who have potentially more niche or specific needs, they often are very difficult to engage. And I think that traditionally we have used a kind of come to us approach in certain environments, public engagement, for example, or public consultation, so I say, because usually after the fact, has an invite-based sort of offer where they actually invite people to come and give their ideas. And I think that requires someone to be quite proactive and let's be honest, not that busy. And a lot of women, find evenings difficult, even the spare 5 minutes in their life. They're not going to sacrifice it for that kind of engagement. Approaching people on the street, again, can be quite repellent to lots of groups. And so I've actually found that after a degree of research, then understanding the time and space that people have got, that where they're going to be relaxed, and that might be by a social media platform, so that people can sort of type in when it's convenient to them, and not have to be approached and deal with people physically. That platform, those sorts of platforms can work. It can be actually accessing an existing Facebook page, or going to community groups, schools, secondary schools. I find really engaging, because they often are confident enough to speak across the genders, and they can speak for their parents too. So actually thinking outside of the traditional boxes of how to approach people, so that you are not getting a sort of numbers game, but you're getting diversity. I think that's really important.
Thanks, Hannah. Sarah, I think you had your hands up as well.
Yes, thank you. In terms of engagement, I think, many of the projects that we work with, community data collection and collecting data by the community is essential, because many governments aren't collecting that data, sometimes on purpose, so they don't have to address the needs of the citizens on the margins. And so to advocate for the incorporation of community in the collection is absolutely essential. But I think also what's important to think about here is just getting together and collecting data creates a community in and of itself. And by building those collection process, we create a community around a collective need, that are advocating for themselves and kind of building that. And so there's also a bit of learning that's happening in that process as well. So I just wanted to add that comment.
Yeah, no, that's definitely interesting. And I guess, Rumana, you did talk about policy, but I thought your project was quite interesting as well, because I guess you worked with the government of Bangladesh at the time. So how do you influence policymakers to actually take this seriously and think about inclusivity as something that needs to be at the start of the design, as opposed to an afterthought that it seems to be on most of our projects?
Thanks, Oyin. Yes, I think this was the biggest achievement of this project. Not that we built X number of drainage and we consulted X number of men and women. I think the big message was that this was the first time the government seen that how you can do a community-led infrastructure project implementation. In the past, there has been infrastructure upgrading projects for many years from different donors and different government projects. But this time, it was really amazing to see that government was able to understand what does community-led decision-making process look like. And I mentioned earlier that I showed some photograph. To get a gender balance, having equal number of men and women in decision-making, it's hard. But if you have at least one city councillor who is a woman, or if you have one community architect who is a woman, that makes a big difference. So I think having this kind of male-dominated infrastructure project, even my firm, they're used to doing consulting work for the government on roads and infrastructure. So having these women in the multidisciplinary team and to be able to talk to the government, who are also very male-dominated. I think there are two things we managed to have: the mainstreaming of women in decision-making, and also in the policy level, how you engage the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Rumana. I can see that we have some excellent questions in the chat, so I'm going to start with some of them. So the first one was, what tools, books, and strategies do we use around participatory design in reaching those hardest to reach? So yeah, I guess how do we engage? What tools can we use to engage the people of the communities, especially those like as you said, Hannah, I think you mentioned like the older generation are generally harder to reach. How do you engage with them, and what tools could you use? I would start with, I guess, Öykü. I guess you've not said anything yet, so start with you on this one.
I mean, basically, there are a lot of research going on at the moment about gender inclusivity. This is something that I also find out more and more about, as I am interested personally as well in this topic as well. So focusing on sustainability and sustainability topics, and beyond that, when you get more deep into the topics of mobility, for example, or housing accessibility, affordability. There you see also the research and studies that are being done also about affordability. For example, for women, it's a different issue than men in terms of in terms of housing, as well as the other infrastructure to the cities. I think this is a bit about showing also interest and checking out the academic studies and also the data collection of various consulting offices as well, to check them out, and that brings also a lot of valuable information. I would really start with that, and that to add to that is that it is really it's not one person's job to think about including women in the planning process or in the data collection process. I think it's very important that for all of us, and we are here today, all of us in one way or another included in planning of urban areas and planning cities and developing and decision making. And it's all of our responsibility to inform ourselves better about this, and not just picking some people who do that job in the company or in the project, but just to spread that. I think that's very important.
Thanks, Öykü. Juan, I can see you have your hands up as well.
Yeah, I just want to maybe come in and say that, raise the fact that I think engagement with communities and women's groups and so on is a process, and it can take resources, it can take time. Often we start with things like, I think having access to information is extremely important in how people can engage in the process or in a decision-making process. I also think it's extremely important to understand the situation, the context, the cultural challenges, restrictions, you know, and try and understand what's the obstacle, or what would be the enabler for participation and engagement. Often we have issues with women, like with childcare, for example. And I think providing that facilities or space for women to bring children or like toddlers to meetings and so on, you know, can often encourage people to come and join. So I think but I think each situation is different, and I think it's important to first understand the situation. There are numerous tools within the humanitarian sectors around community engagement, and I'll be happy to put a couple in the chat.
Thanks, Juan. Pedro, I'm going to bring you into this because I think your project in particular is quite interesting and different as well. So firstly, how did you start off engaging the sex workers, and how did you get them to actually engage in your design so that you could actually build something that was, I guess, safe for them, but also useful for them as well? And how did you go about building that trust process as well? Because I assume that couldn't have been easy, especially with the current stigma around the work.
Yeah, I think one difficult thing is really try to approach them as like as the designers and as someone who has like the say in what the place that they're going to be moved to look like. But for them, we actually had the Liberty, which is one of the organizations that support the sex workers. So since they have the contacts with the sex workers, they conducted their research to understand from them like what do they need and what do they want in this new place. In our part of the design, like we had always on the table the representative of the sex workers coming to us, and she would act as the voice of the sex workers to us. And definitely we couldn't do that without her or without the information that we got from Liberty. And it was I mean, the insights that she explained to us, like the things that she explained to us, how the system works, what it is right now that doesn't work, that is not good for them, and how can we really look at that, how can we improve that? That can only be done if we have the right information from them. So.
Okay, let's move on to another one in the chat. So there is one that I found quite interesting on climate change, and Öykü, I think maybe it's best you start with this. So the question is in Bloomberg Green, it was reported that climate change will affect cities most. How much does it increase the need for us to design and retrofit more resilient places that improve outcomes for vulnerable citizens?
Yeah, it influences a lot, basically, because we know also that the effects of climate change are influencing the vulnerable groups as the worst way. So the vulnerable groups, somehow disadvantaged groups are affected the worst from climate change and the environmental hazards these bring. So this is definitely like this, and this should be, of course, on the higher levels on the agenda to tackle, first of all, the risks that climate change bring, and responsive planning tools to tackle them. Obviously, it's really true that the priorities should be set on the levels of people being influenced by these. Definitely, I agree to that. Yeah.
Thanks, Öykü. Hannah, you have an interesting one in the chat, and I think it has to do with diversity of place for diversity of users. And the question is, what do you mean by this? Do you mean that we create different spaces for different groups of people rather than creating a single inclusive space for all users?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting dilemma, because obviously you don't want to accentuate the problem. You don't want to further ghettoize gender diversity or any form of diversity that it exists. But actually understanding that people use the city in a different way, use space in a different way, means that designing something that fits for everyone is nigh on impossible. I mean, Oyin and I was actually discussing before that it's sort of translatable into the idea of like a multi-faith space. Because if you have a multi-faith space, faiths are so iconic and so ceremonial that actually if you make it sort of applicable to all, and you lose that iconography and that identity and the different, spatial arrangements within religions, you create this kind of vanilla space that nobody wants to use. And it's a little bit like that with urban design. There are certain predispositions in the way that we use space. There are preferences that we have in relationship to the age that we are, the gender that we are, whether or not we are, fully able-bodied, whether or not we are, people who have, sort of skin that loves or dislikes the ultraviolet. There's a whole remit of differences, and actually you can't necessarily address them all in one hit. But the thing to work with is the positives. Actually, if you think about designers not fundamentally changing the way that human race exists, but understanding what are bad habits that can be sort of adjusted and what are positive attributes that can be encouraged. I think urban design is like that, in that we're not actually changing the way people are, but we're looking at how the detrimental effects of what we set up can be adjusted so that they are not detrimental, without creating this kind of homogeneity in design. And yes, you will find that it can, for example, to use my park example, seating is predominantly used by women, but actually if the park isn't used by women because there isn't seating, that's not a positive. And so adding seating and introducing women might well mean that they're justifiably in one type of space more than the other, but are actually integrated of a form. And so I think it's that understanding of the specific needs, so that they're incorporated without being sort of singularly rolled out like wallpaper.
Thanks, Hannah. I think that's really true. So I think this question is probably best addressed to Sarah. So Sarah, I think I'm going to put you on the spot now. And this is one from Pam Alexander. And it says, I'll be glad to hear more about diversity of data and people's needs are expanded via online services as part of a blended approach to bring more people into truly participatory planning who come to the workshop. Sorry, I'm not sure that I've read that correctly. I'm just trying to see if I can understand the question.
Who don't come to the workshops? How you reach the people who don't come to the workshops through online services, which are getting more and more used, with more and more people able to access online all sorts of different consultation processes.
Right, thanks, Pam. Sarah?
So the question is like, how do we access people who can't be there physically through workshops?
Online services.
Yeah, online services. Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is like a really interesting tool that's being developed for planning. And I think there's lots of different ways that people are trying to approach this. One of my colleagues at MIT is using games as a way to engage people and to get their feedback, as sometimes a physical game, but also a digital games, or translating that into the physical space. And the reason he likes doing that is because games also teach us about community needs, as well as allowing us to make decisions. Because I think what's one really important thing is, and when we're talking about planning processes or design processes, is the community also needs to be informed about why designs are helpful or beneficial before they can, really input and make the decisions. And so games are a great way to do that. And online games I think Zoom has totally radically changed this space. And I believe we'll see a lot more of people participating in workshops through Zoom. I think previously getting online on Skype and working this way was not so common, but now even, people's very old grandmothers know how to operate Zoom in order to speak with their family, and certainly will be able to engage in that way. So I think that in a way, we are really going to see increased participation amongst people. So hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Sarah. I think just building on that, because the one thing we haven't really mentioned on this call, which is quite surprising, is COVID and the changes that COVID has made to how we interact with people, but also how we work and how we engage with people. So Rumana, I was just wondering, do you think, based on the fact that we're now all mainly working from home and just use online services more, what changes do you think that could have in terms of our city design? And do you think that we could kind of use this momentum that's currently going on to make any changes in the way we design now?
Hi. Yeah, I think that one thing that the humanitarian sector or development sector, everyone is realizing that the whole entire international development aid landscape has changed, not just because of COVID-19. It's just the talk about localization movement. We are far away from globalization now. Everyone is singing song about localization movement. And in terms of COVID, the projects we do internationally, we've seen that we are looking for national consultants, national experts to be able to lead different projects. So there is a big shift in mindset internationally about how to ensure that localization is not just a buzzword, it's also used into practice. You have the local team, local consultant, who are more reachable to the community. Even now, the project I showed you as an example, most of our team members are from Bangladesh, and they are working, wearing masks and working, talking to the community. So the work is still going on, despite of all the challenges we have due to COVID. So this is my take on this, Hannah.
Thanks, Rumana. That's definitely interesting. I do think, the fact that we are all working from home means that we're, one, able to reach a more international audience. I mean, if you think of a lot of people that have attended this call, no one is limited by having to go to a venue. So you obviously have a wider audience as well, which just means that you're able to reach more people. Pedro, I have a question for you. And this is one on the chat as well, which says, how far are you able to resolve the issues of safety versus privacy and the activity for vulnerable people, and how successful do you think it's been for people that would use that space?
Well, this is a difficult one to answer because we are on the study phase of the project. So right now we did the first study to understand what was the need and to attract investors that could develop the project. And we got one developer interested. So from that, we really start doing the reality check, seeing if what we're really proposing is really feasible. So that's the stage that we are right now with the projects, this feasibility study. And within this feasibility study is really to think about circulation, public spaces, is that does this space, the routing that they need, really works or not. So it's until now, since it's a constant, we are exploring the design. So you cannot say like 100% sure like this works, this doesn't work, but this is the direction that we are moving towards. And I think one thing that really makes a difference is really to take into consideration all of the needs that the sex workers that they need for this project. And we try to, every design decision that we have, whether it's like an entrance or access point, to think, does it work from the point of view of the sex worker? So we really put them at first to see if that would work for them. But at the same time, as you said, like in the very beginning of the chat of the event, is we also need to design something that's like it's for everyone. So we do have them in mind. We do have to make sure that all of these design decisions work for them in terms of privacy. But also we try to make sure that the clients that they want to go there, they also benefit from that design decision. So we try to make everyone that would use that space to have the benefits from all of these aspects of the design, and not only like the main target group. And we're still on this study level that if we get to, and since there's a lot of conversation going on with the municipality, with the operators, with the developers, we can only move forward on the design to really make the design decisions like once the project like really move forwards to the next stage and level. So I think that's when you can really go one level further on the reality check for all of these guidelines.
Thanks, Pedro. I'm conscious of time. Hannah, one thing that you discussed during your presentation was taking back the night, but then you also talked about how the media influences the fear, or potentially adds to the fear of women, and how they use public spaces. And I just wanted to expand on that, because I think that's probably something that hasn't necessarily come up in the other speakers. But so how big a part do you think the media plays in terms of creating this fear in women, and how do you think that can be limited, or how do we interact with that going forward, I guess?
I think that unfortunately, statistically, there are certain things like crossing a road or sort of, cycling. They are quite risk heavy versus other things, but they don't make good TV. And I don't know why, but most people watch sort of crime dramas and just everyday films, some of which have, I think, disturbingly low certificates, sort of PG or certificate 12. And violence against women in those is predominant, and it often happens at nighttime. And I think that accentuates an issue that a lot of women have anyway, because of certification, and because most teenagers don't respond to certification from a very early age. So I have a son and a daughter, and I see with my daughter that she is very aware of it going dark. And so she'll rush out to the corner shop. She's sort of soon to be 13, and she'll rush back, and it's barely a few meters, but the moment it goes dark, she won't do that. And I think that that's not an influence of her own experience. That's not an influence of me putting fear into her. That's a media influence. And it does, if you look at sort of the data on how the media presents sort of female violence, it is very orientated towards sort of the nighttime. It doesn't necessarily proportionally represent domestic abuse in the day, to the degree to which domestic abuse in the day by someone is representative of how much violence you're going to experience. So I think that is a real influence. And I think that it's one of those things that we can, aid through design, but we have to understand it first. So we have to understand, effective street lighting, not that gives you a perceived sense of safety. As I was saying, things like peripheral vision, spotlighting is actually can make it worse. We go in and out of extremes of light, and it means that our peripheral vision is affected. And also housing, lighting, you know, when you walk past the front of houses, how houses light their own front gardens, can again give you a kind of perception of whether you're safe or not. But I do think it's strongly media influenced, which is, you know, a real shame, because, as I said, from a very early age, I think women sort of learn that they are restricted, and they shouldn't be.
Thanks, Hannah. And one, I'm going to invite you next to speak, because I've just seen your message on your chat. But I guess another thing I would like to explore just around that topic is the part that media has to play in terms of influencing your fear and how you feel fearful as a woman. But also, do you think that media potentially shows behaviors that men then think are acceptable? So do they sometimes portray behaviors that men, because it's being portrayed, men then think, okay, that's acceptable and that's acceptable behavior? So is that another way to look at it, as opposed to, I guess, the fear in women as well? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about just the gender switch. You know, if you switch the terminology and the pronouns, and you sort of direct it towards a man versus a woman, then our degree of expectation of safety, even things like, you know, people still talking about what you wear and how much you drink as a woman walking around the high streets at night, it just doesn't translate. It just doesn't split gender wise. And we have to be progressive about this in terms of understanding that, you know, we have, cities have grown up and human race has grown up and over millennia, and actually the existence of gender equality, the process or the expectation of gender equality, is a very small proportion of that. But there is still, you know, no denying that there's a huge gap to be straddled, and it just isn't, you know, it isn't translatable in terms of the way that the expectations that we have and the way that the media portray sort of the equality of expectations of things like safety and of, you know, actually our equality of space.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to also just find out how you empower women to feel safe in spaces that they feel are male dominating, I guess. But I think that's probably a different discussion. Juan, I think you had something to add to it.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because when we're doing the guidelines, I mean, a lot of it is kind of almost anecdotal in a way of how we think what makes a place safer. Hannah was talking about, like, you know, lighting. You know, we're kind of like, yes, when we have latrines and stuff in a camp, there should be lights. But sometimes, like, providing a lit space in the camp after dark can also be a place where men come and hang out, and that can also then create like a sense of like unsafety. I don't know. I mean, for us, it's like a big challenge. Like, there's a lot of instances, I mean, well documented reports of women not using bathrooms and wash areas after dark. People just hold and wait for daylight or go out further in the field, or, you know, basically use part of their shelter for bathrooms and washrooms. And I think finding that kind of fine balance of what makes a place perceived as safe can be like quite challenging and quite tricky. And I think sometimes requires back and forth again with the like women's groups or with communities, or some kind of agreement with the community as like a broader community on, you know, like code of conduct, use of space agreed by all, you know, that kind of thing, to make sure that people feel safe enough to use the bathroom at night.
Yeah, thanks, Juan. And I guess it would also just be quite important to also just get the buy-in of the full community, because you can design spaces for women. However, you need the buy-in of the women and men in the community as well. So it's a bit more than just engaging with the vulnerable people. It's pretty much engaging with the whole community as a whole. So I'm very conscious of time, and we have so many questions. I don't think we'll be able to get through them, but I'm just going to invite the speakers to say a final word and just say what your key takeaways are from this discussion today. So I'll start off with Öykü.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks also for inviting me to this great discussion. I heard really amazing presentations and really good ideas. For me, it strengthens the fact that in all aspects of planning and design right now, we have to consider gender as a factor, and gender inclusiveness. And for me, what I took also today is the emphasis on participation after the presentations, and how to integrate different groups of people and create a place of participation, inclusive planning. For me, that was really cool.
Thanks, Öykü. Pedro?
Well, for me, it's really how important is the gender and sexuality, and in how this shapes how people behave and how we interact with the public space, and that we really have to put that on the planning agenda. We really have to consider that, just to make sure that we create this this very inclusive environment and cities for everyone. And I think that's something that like everyone here touched upon on that. How can we really come up with ideas? How can we approach that in a different way? And how can we really be? And another thing that we have to be loud with that. We really have to communicate that. We really have like to be involved in that. So we can make sure that things will move on the right direction.
Thanks, Pedro. Juan?
Maybe just to reiterate the approach that this is, whether it's planning or whether it's community engagement, is all a process. And I think ensuring representation and participation, I think across, all gender, but also all age groups, and especially those with specific needs. And maybe just, I was really struck by what Hannah was saying about, diversity of space. And I think sometimes specific needs require specific space. And I think like be open to also that consideration in the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Juan. Sarah?
Hi, yeah. I think what we really learned here is that it's essential to design space using an intersectional perspective. And doing that means including diverse groups in that process. And that inclusion can happen from the time of developing data and observing the site all the way through to our final plans, and really looking at space through the eyes of our users. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Hannah?
Yeah, I think, a few things that have been fascinating for me are really great. The majority of my students are female, but the majority of the women that I work with, the people that I work with, are not women. So it's been really enjoyable to hear about different professions working internationally and making a difference in this area. So I've really enjoyed that. I think that as Juan said, I think that for me, the nuances within gender, so it's, women and girls is such a generic subject, given it's half the population, and there's so many nuances in that to deal with. So understanding, as you say, the difference between sex workers who may or may not be female, if issues to do with age and how we change dramatically, from toddlers to puberty to elderly women, and how those needs need to be addressed, all seem to come down to this idea that actually participating and engaging with the user is really key. One thing I think that hasn't necessarily come up, which I think is super important, is actually then re-engaging to understand the success of a project. As designers and sort of specialists, we often sort of, the moment we stop getting paid, we sort of stop looking. I think it's the idea that actually you should sort of put a fee aside for you to look again in 5-10 years and reassess it. I think is really important. And finally, I think there's the whole thing of what's been quite interesting is it's not much talk about children. Often when people talk about women, they automatically say sort of women and children, and they assume that every woman is a mother. And so I've been really actually quite pleased that that's been quite a small part of the discussion. Maybe there's a part 2 for you to organise that touches on that in more detail. But yeah, a really fascinating day. So thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. I feel like you're just giving me a prompt to do a part 2. And last but not least, Rumana.
Yeah, I also would like to stitch with Hannah what she said about children. I think, yes, women and children, we just put them in the same group. But like I started in my presentation, are we thinking about the future of the children? And also, Öykü, you mentioned about that 70% of building is causing more climate change and global warming. And the best thing to do is not build, but as built environment professionals, how can we make sure that we make a fine balance? We think about the broader sustainability issue. And one thing I liked from one is that she mentioned about hangout place for guys when they have a street light and then the girls are feeling more uncomfortable to go to the toilet. So when one experience is that when we were consulting women, men were feeling a bit left behind. And when we talk about young women, girls, we sometimes forget about the boys, and violence and crime, it happens because the guys don't have enough places of recreation. So I think that we need to really have a very clear perspective that gender and inclusion doesn't only mean men, women and young girls, it means inclusive society. Thank you.
Thanks, Rumana. And yeah, there's been so many takeaways for me from this. I think engagement with the community is very important. I think representation and having a representative panel in terms of food design is really important. I think we could probably do more with the data we collect, or even start collecting this data so we can actually use it for more is really important. And lastly, I think we also need to just take an intersectional approach to our design to make sure that we're considering everyone, because even on this call, although we focused on women, we haven't really talked about mothers, we haven't talked about women with disabilities. So there's so many, it's really hard to, I guess, just talk about one sector. There's so many things that, or different factors that we would need to also consider. But I'd like to thank you all for joining this conversation. I hope you have enjoyed it. We'll definitely consider a part 2 to this, because there's so many questions we didn't get to. But thank you all and have a very good evening. See you in the next one.